I've been disenfranchised from the ability to vote because of a felony conviction. Not all states do that, but most states do. And it was always about lessening people in their status in society and in their ability to have a say over their own lives.
I think there's an imagination out there of the people who don't vote don't want to. It's not because they can't. And that if they can't, it's because they're not citizens. And I don't think people really think about the fact that there's this whole other group of folks who are disenfranchised from voting because of their criminal background. And this idea that once you have that background, it's very difficult to come back and be able to vote. I think, asking people in places where there's high voter percentage, high voter turnout, to talk about like what their thoughts are, I think will be really interesting. And I think really highlight some of the ways in which there's misconceptions about why people don't vote and the barriers that actually exist.
Yeah, we live just right in Waukesha here. Yeah. The more people that are voting, the better the community is, because then the more voices are being heard and the more everyone has a say in what's going on and what politically is happening in the community.
Because it helps run the country, supposedly.
I grew up watching the news. Like, I was always the odd kid out. I was reading the newspaper at like 5, drinking coffee like my dad. And I became a news junkie early on. And the biggest thing for me is political engagement from the individual is, for so long, seemed like, it doesn't matter. It's not, it doesn't really affect anything. But I wholeheartedly believe that, no, every single person gets the chance to vote because it matters.
You know that in Wisconsin there are tens of thousands of legal citizens paying taxes and living all around you that are not allowed to vote?
Really?
No. So that's people with criminal records. I'm just curious your thoughts on that. Maybe you never thought about it, but just curious your thoughts are and if you think that it's good or bad.
I never really thought about it.
Yeah, I've never thought about it either.
Most of the people who I've talked to, who I know and are connected to, who don't believe that voting matters, are usually in the disenfranchised category, or they are second generation, third generation coming out of that kind of a category. And they've been fed the same kind of rhetoric and the same kind of fear that I was, which is if you step too far out of the guidelines and try to empower yourself with that community voice, which is the vote, there will be consequences. And that's unfortunate, because I've seen it firsthand, the stories from my grandmother, my great uncles, talking about being chased away from the voting polls, a friend of theirs being hanged, lynched, maimed, because they tried to exercise their right to vote, because they wanted a real, genuine, tangible say over how their lives went in their neighborhoods.
I think the methods in which people have been disenfranchised, kind of go back hundreds of years. And we really think in political science, we think about 1965, the Voting Rights Act, as being this like kind of seminal time when, it became known at the federal and state level, like we need to do something about this. I would argue that in 2022, what we see is really kind of a different kind of disenfranchisement. We don't have poll taxes. We don't have people beating up folks as they try to get to the polls. But we create these voter ID laws. We change the rules on when you can vote and how you can vote, and we make it more difficult in times when there's a pandemic.
I understand that there's the double edge of when someone doesn't vote, it lets someone else's voice speak louder. But then the question becomes, well, whose voice becomes the loudest?
I think that they should have the same vote. I think that there's talk that one side will get all the votes from the people that have records, but I don't think that's the case at all.
And when you talk about being a person of color, being directly impacted, I come out of multi-generational layers of not having my voice heard, not having my personhood acknowledged, not being listened to. It's going to take a couple years for us to turn that sort of tide around, but it's worth it, because I've seen the alternative to not participating. We don't want that for anybody. We want for everybody to be part of this process, and we want to be more inclusive than we have ever been.
One of the things that's really powerful that I always hear is that the fact that people are trying to keep you from voting is a sign. That means there's some value to that they don't want you to express, right? That they see the power that you could have and they're trying to keep it down. And so this is an opportunity for you to fight that. And it feels very small, but it can be a very significant way.
The people we interviewed from areas with higher voter turnout took voting for granted. Like they never even thought about not being able to vote. It was ingrained in them. And Paru made a great point about if powerful, wealthy people want to make it harder or impossible for people with records or in jails to vote, that speaks volumes about the significance of voting. I've long been indifferent towards voting because of, one, how corrupt and money-driven the system is, and two, I find more value in community work and making connections about important topics like addressing the criminal justice system. But this voter engagement project actually opened my eyes to something I never really thought about before. Not everyone has time or ability to get involved at the level that I and so many other grassroots humanizers do, but we are just parts of this work. Success requires the body, the collective. So having decision makers in office who will listen and act when we organize and advocate requires that voters in struggling communities vote. So those of us who can't vote need those who can to vote, and make that vote multiply by simply letting others in your lives know you voted and why. It's a small thing for potentially huge impact. In fact, this teamwork action is the only way things will ever genuinely and sustainably get better.